Hi everyone, welcome to the TriEssence martial art channel. Believe it or not, an episode of Fact or Fiction. Haven't done one of these in quite a long time actually. However, today's video will not be directly related to Chinese martial art. However, it is related to history, which is why it's going to be part of Fact or Fiction. And even though it is not directly related to Chinese martial art, I believe Chinese martial art enthusiasts can still learn something from the content of this video in terms of how to tell fact from fiction, especially on the topic of academic dishonesty. Alright, so the reason behind this video goes like this. As you all should have known by now, Netflix has just released a documentary, quote unquote, about the Egyptian queen Cleopatra VII, and it has basically caused a huge controversy because the main cast that plays Cleopatra is a British African ethnic person. And I hope you also should know by now that Cleopatra VII is part of what is known as the Ptolemy Empire or Ptolemy Dynasty, and they descend from Macedonians, which makes them ethnically Mediterranean people. And if we were really to put a label to skin color, they're more pale and more in line with Caucasian than they are with Sub-Saharan African. Now, just in case you haven't realized this, I'm actually Asian, so I don't really have a narrative or a bone to chew in this entire controversy, because whether it's played by Caucasian or played by African, I'm Asian, so it doesn't really matter to me. And I'm not subscribed to Netflix and I don't watch that, so it doesn't have any direct effect to me. However, as a student of history and a student of academic, I do have an issue when things are labeled as documentaries but do not follow historical accuracy. Now, there are already a lot of videos on YouTube talking about the historical accuracy or the lack thereof of this documentary, so I am not going to talk about that. What I'm talking about is that about 2 weeks ago, I came across a video by YouTube recommendation algorithm that reads something like this. It says, Netflix Cleopatra, why everyone is wrong. Now, when a video makes such a bold claim that everyone is wrong, my curiosity just forces me to click on it and see what great discovery this person has to say. And in a nutshell, the video was pretty mediocre. I'm going to include a link in the description, so if you do want to check out it for context purpose, you're welcome to, although I wouldn't recommend you wasting your time watching that video. But in a nutshell, initially it does state the obvious, which is that we believe, or the historians rather believe, that Cleopatra is part of the Ptolemy dynasty, which are extending from Macedonia, which makes them subterranean people. However, this video's author, despite claiming that he doesn't have a stance in this debate, try to be smart by subtly including that stance without physically taking it, so people can't accuse him of taking a stance. So in that video, he basically hinted that even though that, historians believe the Ptolemy Empire came from Macedonia, we are not sure who Cleopatra's mother is. And because that is uncertain, she could be Sub-Saharan African, and therefore Cleopatra might be African. Now, here's the first problem to any academic or scientific or even martial art historical debate, is that we don't have evidence of something, it doesn't mean the opposite is true. So just because we don't know her mother's exact ethnic category, it doesn't mean therefore it's okay to portray her as Sub-Saharan African. I mean, her mother could be Martian, could be alien, could be, from Andromeda. I mean, it could be whatever, right? That is not science, and that's not evidence. Just because we don't know something doesn't make your claim true. You see, this isn't the court of criminal law where you are innocent until proven guilty. Alright? In science, you have to prove something to be true before you can claim it to be true. Just because there's no definitive evidence doesn't give credence to your claim. Now, obviously, people could argue that, well, then what about the other claim? How do we know that her mother is from, Mediterranean, is Macedonian? Well, we don't. However, there are countless sculptures and artwork from the Roman Empire while Cleopatra VII was alive and visiting Rome, and from all those artwork depictions, we can clearly see that she has European features. And while that's not definitive evidence, it is far more greater evidence than the simple fact that we don't know the ethnicity of her mother. So that is the first point I would like to make in this video, is that just because there's no definitive evidence of one thing doesn't mean something else is true. And in which case, we look at other evidence to weigh out what is most likely to be true. And currently, the mainstream historians still believe she's most likely Macedonian. Now, if this was the only issue of that video, then I wouldn't bother be making a response video or even comment on his video, because when people are stupid, the best response to do is just ignore them, right? Don't give them any more attention. And that was what I was intended to do, until later in the video, he cited 2 scientific papers on genetic studies of Northern Macedonia and claimed that there are scientific evidence that Macedonians are actually black. At that point is when I felt that I need to comment on his video, because, well, I don't really care when people make dumb statements, but when people quote science the wrong way, that does piss me off, and I believe that is far more dangerous than people just making conspiracy theories. Because when you make a conspiracy theory, people know it's a conspiracy and can choose not to believe it. But when a person quotes scientific paper incorrectly, that creates much more damage in terms of misinformation. Because people that are not academically trained are going to say, oh, well, actually the science paper that's supporting his point of view, and they're far more likely to believe this outrageous claim when scientific papers are quoted. Which is why pseudoscience is far more dangerous than conspiracy theory nutjob stuff. Okay? And here we're gonna watch a little bit of what he said in his video about the scientific research that support the idea that Cleopatra was not Mediterranean like Caucasian.
A group of European scientists studied the DNA of individuals from the Republic of Macedonia. And what they found was unbelievable. They noticed that Macedonians belonged to the older Mediterranean substratum, like Iberians, including Basques, North Africans, Italians, French, Cretans, Jews, Lebanese, Turks, Anatolians, Armenians, and Iranians. Secondly, Macedonians weren't related with geographically close Greeks, who don't belong to that older Mediterranean substratum. And finally, the Greeks were found to have a substantial relatedness to sub-Saharan people like Ethiopians, which separate them from other Mediterranean groups. So, the study showed that the Macedonians have a genetic makeup that is distinct from their geographically close Greek neighbors. They are linked to the ancient populations of the area, and they have unique genetic connection to sub-Saharan Ethiopian people. Another study conducted in 2019 also proved that around 30% of them belonged to the African haplogroup E, which originated in sub-Saharan Africa.
So initially, I was actually quite polite. I just simply want to point out that firstly, his conclusion on the first paper's abstract is actually wrong. In the paper, it says that they found a connection between Greeks' genetics and Ethiopians, but they did not find a connection between Macedonian genetics and Ethiopians, and therefore they believe that Macedonians are genetically not related to the Greek people or Ethiopians. However, in his conclusion, he basically said that this paper has shown that Macedonians originated from Ethiopia, which support his idea that Cleopatra is probably black. I mean, this may be an honest mistake, an oversight, or it's just him twisting the research because he probably knows people don't actually read the abstract. Most people don't. Well, I happen to be academic, so I did read it and I found this discrepancy. And the funny thing is, throughout the rest of the interaction between me and him on his video was over 18 back and forth replies, he never addressed this point one. He just ignored it and pretended it didn't happen, like an ostrich that stuck his head into the ground, okay? Because clearly here he made a serious academic mistake, but he does not want to address it. He doesn't want to say, I made a mistake, I read it wrong or whatever. He just ignored it. And that kind of shows the lack of academic integrity this guy has. The second point I made to him is that in the second abstract, it clearly stated that the current northern Macedonia consists of three major groups of people. There's the ethnic Macedonians, there are the Albanians, and then the Turks. And during the genetic study, they found that the Albanians has the E1b Y chromosome group, which are typically associated with sub-Saharan Africans. But this was not mentioned in his interpretation of this abstract. He just said that in the second paper, they also found that Macedonians are essentially Africans because they have this particular Y chromosome gene haplogroup. So just because a population of people possess the E1b1 haplogroup, which believed to originate from sub-Saharan Africa, it does not mean they physically look like African. Especially when this migration has believed to be happened 26,000 years ago. Okay, that is pre any of our known civilization. So what this means is that when people possessing this E1b gene migrated from sub-Saharan Africa to Mediterranean, it was 26,000 years ago. Okay, Cleopatra ruled around 51 BC. So you can see there's a huge time gap between when this migration happened. This is actually known as the last major migration of Homo sapiens from Africa into Europe. Okay, there's a huge time gap between when this happened and when Cleopatra existed. So even if we assume, which we can't, but even if we assume that when this gene originally migrated into Mediterranean, that people did look like sub-Saharan Africans precisely, over 23,000 years of evolution is not going to guarantee that they still look like sub-Saharan Africans. I mean, if that is remotely possible, then let me remind you that all Homo sapiens, that's all of us, trace our ancestry back to Africa. In fact, Homo sapiens came from Africa, and then we moved out from Africa to the rest of the world. And yes, in more recent studies, they have found that Neanderthals and Denisovans, among other hominins of the period, actually intermingle with Homo sapiens. So this moving out, populating the world isn't a one-way road, but that is beyond the scope of this video. Okay. The point here is we all can trace our ancestry back to Africa, but do we all look like Africans? No. Is there something wrong with looking like Africans? Of course not. What I'm saying is just because a particular ethnic group can trace its origin back to Africa, it doesn't mean they're supposed to still look like African, and that's the point. So you can't use genetic heritage to predict how a person is supposed to look like, especially not when this time period between the person in question and when the genes migrated is over 23,000 years of gap. A lot could happen in 23,000 years. So this is no evidence at all. So his reply to me was a huge wall of text with no structure and paragraphing. So I'm not going to read everything. I mean, you can read it if you want to check context. I'm not twisting his words. But what's important here to note is the following. He basically first said haplogroup don't define phenotype, and I've never said the opposite. So what he's saying here is that he agrees with me that haplogroup, i.e. the E1B gene, doesn't define our physical look. So he agrees with this. However, he then says this. R1B, which I believe is a typo, has been linked to population in Africa, but when we look at these people phenotype, they look exactly like modern Africans. They are not white. So in his last sentence, he just says that haplogroup don't define the way we look. And right after, he's saying that this gene is connected to African, and when we look at them, they look African and not white. The logic of the lack of here is astonishing. So I'm not a geneticist, okay, so I might be wrong. But the way I see it, if modern Albanians, which don't look like sub-Saharan Africans at all, possess this E1B1 haplogroup, that pretty much is evident in itself that this haplogroup does not dictate how a person looks like, correct? Otherwise, then the modern Albanians should all look like sub-Saharan African, which means this entire train of thought and argument is not logically sound at all. It's just garbage. And if he agrees, as he claimed, that the haplogroup don't define the way we look, well then why does he even cite these two genetic papers to support his idea that Cleopatra don't look like modern Macedonians? Okay, he then responded to me. Again, I'm just going to quote out the important part, but you're welcome to check everything for context. That, so you decided today that Macedonians are ancient and belong to that land and are linked to ancient Greeks and deserve to be called ethnic Macedonians, and that Albanians who also live there are foreigners and not ethnic. Just because the country is called Macedonia does not mean it represents ancient Macedonia. Well, so obviously what he's trying to do here is to argue for the legitimacy of his point of view by mixing Albanians and ancient Macedonians, because remember, Albania supposedly carries the E1B1 haplogroup, which supposedly, according to him, incorrectly, validate the fact that they came from Saharan Africa and therefore should look like Africans. So therefore, for his narrative to work, modern Macedonians which don't have that E1B1 haplogroup cannot be the real descendant of ancient Macedonians. Otherwise, his point of view would not stand. But here's the thing. When I actually went and read the papers that he quoted and cited, it paints a completely different picture. Here is a piece of the discussion came directly from the first paper. It reads, our result shows that Macedonians are related to other Mediterraneans and do not show a close relationship with the Greeks. This supports the theory that Macedonians are one of the most ancient peoples existing in the Balkan Peninsula, probably long before arrival of the Mycenaean Greeks, about 2000 BC. Other possible explanation is that they might have shared a genetic background with the Greeks before an hypothetical admixture between Greeks and sub-Saharans might have occurred. So basically what this paper has told us is that the Macedonians are among the oldest people to have populated the Balkan Peninsula, that area, geographic location. Even older than the Greeks, who only arrived on the scene around 2000 BC. And while they found a genetic connection between the Greeks and sub-Saharan Africans, there was no connection between Macedonians and sub-Saharan African. So this paper actually shows the exact opposite result of what this guy claims in his video.
So, the study showed that the Macedonians have a genetic makeup that is distinct from their geographically close Greek neighbors. They are linked to the ancient populations of the area, and they have unique genetic connection to sub-Saharan Ethiopian people.
And if you look at the population sample for this genetic paper, it clearly states that they sampled from members of the Republic of Macedonia today, and these are people who speak the language and are historically or ancestrally not belonging to any of the minority group. What does this show us is that the scientist, the real expert in this case, right, who studies genetics, believes that the modern Macedonians are the descendants of ancient Macedonia. Otherwise, why would they study this population and then drawing on a conclusion about ancient genetic ancestry? So unless these guys who has PhD in genetics knows less than this YouTube content creator, otherwise his whole claim that Macedonians are not real ancient Macedonians, what the Albanians are, is actually nonsense. Now, I'm not saying the Albanians are not Macedonians. Maybe they are. Again, I'm not an anthropologist, so I don't know for sure. However, if Albanians were also historically part of Macedonia at some point, it doesn't change the fact that Macedonians are the oldest people in that piece of land and don't trace their ancestry back to Africa the same way Greeks does. Now, I'm not saying that they are not from Africa from the beginning of human civilization. Homo sapiens all came from Africa, remember? I'm not saying that, but for the context of this argument of how Cleopatra should look like, the Macedonians can be considered as native people of the Balkan Peninsula, which makes them more ethnically close to what we perceive as Mediterraneans rather than sub-Saharan Africans. Now let's look at the other paper and see what they have to say about this whole thing. So here you can see the discussion section of the second paper in question, which reads something like this. The predominant haplogroup related to the Macedonian subpopulation to the larger Y chromosome landscape in Europe and Near East, which originates during the Neolithic period. For those of you that might not understand what that exactly means, they basically are saying during the Neolithic period, 7000 BC to about 1700 BC, Macedonians basically roamed around Europe and might have some connection to the Near East. Okay, there's no mention of sub-Saharan Africa at all. Again, they might trace back to Africa before the Neolithic period, but let me remind you, Cleopatra ruled in 51 BC. So anything that happened too far back in history is irrelevant for the context of this discussion. What we do know is, since 7000 BC, these Macedonians has been playing around in Europe and didn't came from Africa. And if sub-Saharan African facial features should persist beyond the Neolithic period until when Cleopatra was born, well then frankly today we should also look like sub-Saharan Africans, and we don't. So that's clearly not true. The paper then reads, the frequent haplogroup, the I2-P215, links the Macedonian-speaking Macedonians to the Balkan, and the R1A-M198 to the large Slavic-speaking population of Eastern Europe. Again, you don't have to worry about these numbers and what exactly gene or haplogroup they belong to. But what this essentially saying is that the Macedonians lived in the Balkan Peninsula. So this concurs with the other paper we just looked at, that they are native people of the Balkan Peninsula. The other haplogroup can trace its origin to Eastern Europe. Again, none are related in more recent context to sub-Saharan Africa. And then, And then it goes on saying the dominant haplogroup J2A-M410 placed the Turk-speaking Macedonians in the context of population from the Near East, and the haplogroup E1b, right, the one in question that supposedly proved the African ancestry, connected Albanian speakers from Macedonia with other population from the southeast of Europe. So there you go. This paper that's supposed to support his idea that Cleopatra is African actually never mentioned Africa at all. Even the Albanians, right, which is like the last straw that this guy is grasping on, right, trying to make a connection between Albanians and ancient Macedonian, and therefore they must be African. In this paper, it clearly says that these Albanian-speaking Macedonians come from Europe still. Now, here is the thing. How can this content creator get this so wrong? In the first paper, the researchers confirmed that ancient Macedonians are not related to ancient Greeks. Ancient Greeks have hypothetically admixtured their genes with sub-Saharan Africans. Ancient Macedonians did not, which is the exact opposite of what this guy's point of view is, or how he's using this paper to prove his point of view. And the second paper, while mentioning the E1b haplogroup, did not mention its connection to Africa once. Obviously, we do know that this ultimately do trace back to Africa, but like I said, 26,000 years ago. But there's no relevance to the topic of discussion, which is Cleopatra's physical appearance, nor has it got any relevance to this paper, where we're trying to map out the geographical movement of people that makes up modern Republic of Macedonia. Up to this point, one has to wonder, did this guy actually read the paper that he claimed he has read? Or did he just look at the abstract and not even understanding the abstract correctly, rush into quoting this paper to support his point of view? So he's not actually factually looking for evidence for the truth, he's simply looking for evidence or something that looks like evidence to support his point of view. And that is a very, very bad way to convey objective truth or to engage in any scientific inquiry. For a scientific inquiry, you have to suspend your personal bias and look at the fact and evidence only. Even if that is against what you believe to be true, as a scientist, you accept the fact and evidence that you have found. But in his case, either he doesn't read the paper, or he couldn't understand the abstract, or he simply chose to ignore what the paper had to say. All he wanted is to look intelligent and academic while citing some paper that actually says the opposite of what he's trying to say. And to drive my point home, in the following response, he basically said, the study talked about the E1b haplogroup coming in that area during the late Pharaonic period. Well, it didn't. You see, at this point, he really had the two papers confused. Pharaonic period was mentioned in the first abstract that he cited, which talks about the connection between Greek people and sub-Saharan Africans, and how Macedonians are not connected to neither of them. In that one, they basically suggested that this migration from sub-Saharan Africa toward Greek, where they mix their genes, probably happened, or potentially could have happened, around the Pharaonic period of Egypt. Whereas the paper, the second one, that actually talks about the E1b haplogroup, does not mention any Egyptian dynasty or period at all. And not only this shows that this guy got his academic citing confused, which is always bad, he also doesn't know anything about actual genetic research and general knowledge on haplogroup. Because if he does, then he would know that the E1b haplogroup currently is believed to basically migrate from sub-Saharan Africa to Mediterraneans around 26,000 years ago, not during the Pharaonic period of Egypt. So this just shows you that he has no general knowledge on this topic. But here is his dilemma, right? If this E1b haplogroup left Africa 26,000 years ago, then it doesn't support his point of view that during Cleopatra's time, Macedonians still look like sub-Saharan Africans. So you can see his tendency of not double-checking the fact so long as whatever he understands support his own point of view and narrative. And that's a very bad practice in terms of academic work. Obviously, YouTuber content creators are not strictly academic, but I believe if someone is starting to cite research papers to support a point of view, then one should judge them based on proper academic integrity and standard. And in this regard, he failed utterly and completely. At this point, I basically questioned him whether he actually read the paper, because as I've already shown you, the discussion section of the paper says the very opposite of what he's trying to say. Now obviously he insists that he had read the paper, but I severely doubt that he did. And here's the reason. So firstly, research papers cost money. Okay, you have to pay around $25 or sometimes even $50 for a given research paper. Otherwise you can't view them. And I don't believe this guy, given his lack of academic integrity, is willing to cough up that much money to read two papers when he can just quote the abstract incorrectly. As for why I read those papers, it's because I'm currently enrolled into an Australian university. And with my university account, I have access to most of the scientific papers in most fields around the world. So I can check them for free. And only because of this privilege were I able to spot his lie and academic misconduct. Another tell sign that he never read those papers is basically, as you can see from this picture here, when you have full access to this particular paper, it says on top full access with an icon that's a lock that's unlocked. When you don't have access to that paper, it basically looks like he's screen grabbed in his video. Admittedly, not all journals have this indication, but this particular paper does. And from his own video, one can clearly see that he never had access to this paper. Now, later on in this argument, he started quoting one paragraph from the paper and basically trying to prove that he did read the paper. But in my opinion, chances are, after I accused him of not reading the paper, in order to save his face, he went and he bought one of the paper. That's basically how I think. I mean, it might not be true. He might have access to the actual full paper from the beginning, I don't know. But if he did, one would have to ask, why was his conclusion so different, in fact, polar opposite of what those papers are actually saying? And this comes to the heart of the point in my video, is that people lie. People lie for all kinds of reasons, especially when they're trying to take a stance and have a particular narrative. And when people do that, they are inherently biased. Even scientists and psychologists can be biased. But at least when you've learned the scientific method, you are taught to try to eliminate your biases. Now this is very difficult and still exists in the scientific field all the time, especially when there is something to be gained when you take a stance. But in this particular instance, I have nothing to gain whether Cleopatra looks Macedonians or sub-Saharan African. Therefore, I can remain objective and look at the actual facts. And I'm not interested in the grand fact of what exactly she looked like, but just on the fact of what these two papers are saying versus what this guy pretends these papers are saying. And this is not an isolated incident. This kind of misappropriation and misinterpretation of scientific research happens all the time, especially since social media is becoming a thing where people start to watch all kinds of self-created content. It becomes increasingly hard to basically differentiate between correct information and misinformation. And a lot of people, like this one in particular, they would pretend to cite scientific papers to increase the appearance of their credentials, but in fact are still feeding people lies. Which is why, for anyone who really cares about the truth, which is basically what I do in this channel in general, then you would really have to fact check these claims. Even when someone said, some scientist says this, you have to ask which scientist, which paper, what was said. And if you can't do that, then rather be skeptical about any claim, especially when the claim contradicts mainstream understanding. Now, I'm not saying that mainstream understanding is always right. Before Albert Einstein, no one knew that gravity is actually a result of curved space. But you got to ask yourself this: how many Einsteins has there been historically, versus the likelihood of you coming in contact with a charlatan or fraud or someone who misappropriates information? Right? The chance of you meeting a fraud is far greater than meeting a once-in-a-lifetime genius. Which is why a good practice is that when we encounter information that contradicts the conventional understanding, always be skeptical about it. I'm not saying dismiss it completely, but be skeptical and fact-check those claims. And more often than not, you'll find that those supposedly fact or evidence or scientific research backed by scientists are probably not what these people claim it out to be. Alright, so I hope this video has been somewhat interesting despite its deviating from my theme of martial art related history. But like I said, understanding the scientific inquiry and the scientific method of conducting inquiry is important in understanding or differentiate fact from fiction. Lastly, I would just like to re-emphasize that I don't care whether Cleopatra is sub-Saharan African or Macedonian, so long as there are clear scientific evidence to prove either. And until today that we have found her remains, and her remain is in a good condition where a genetic study can be conducted, otherwise, currently, the best information that we can rely on are historical text evidence and historical artwork that depict how she looks like. And based on this evidence, the current best interpretation is that she looks more like Mediterranean Caucasian, i.e. Macedonians, than sub-Saharan African, which makes the casting of Netflix problematic and historically inaccurate. Alright, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you do, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you can support me on Patreon, that would be greatly appreciated. I do have a whole collection of Patreon exclusive videos going through the in-depth analysis of the 4 fundamental forces of internal and how that can be applied to Yiquan as well as Wuxing Tongbei. As always, a shout out to all my Patreon supporters. Thank you guys so much for supporting me. And as always, you guys are welcome to message me with any questions on current content or suggestions for future content. Thanks for watching TriEssence Martial Art channel, and I'll see you next time.